what a way to begin. And with our beloved daf, to begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Avram and Sheen Kelman for dedicating all the shir memory of their parents, Jack Bennett for dedicating all the shiurim in honor of Givati Brigade First Sergeant Nikolai Rappaport, and Dr. Linda Weinberg in memory of her husband, Dr. Paul Weinberg, Peretz Moshe ben Avram David. Our week of learning sponsors, the Rosen and Miller families, as a zechus for Refuah Shlema for Chaim Yosef ben Batya, Saeed and Simahik, in honor of all of those who helped to make the outdoor minyan on Rosh Hashanah, the Stanger and Weinberg families in honor of Doug Stanger's special birthday, and our day of learning sponsors, Jerry and Abby Applebaum, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Abby's grandfather and to celebrate their grandson's first birthday. We thank all of our sponsors for their incredible generosity. And also with that, let us begin. A lot to do today. So we are picking up, today's daf is Yud Zayin, and we are picking up on Tes Zayin Amud Beis 16b at the two dots, Iboy Lahu. So I apologize for getting started a few minutes late. Hashem, some technical difficulties. It wouldn't be a new haschala without some type of turbulence. That's the way every single new beginning starts. So halabai, this should be the extent of our life turbulence. Meretz Hashem. But with that, the Gemara says as follows: Halacha karebi lekula o lechorma. So remember again, the Gemara just finished talking about whether or not one is permitted to go ahead and make an eruv chatzeros. Well, it's an eruv chatzeros, eruv tchumen on Yom Tiv that goes into Shabbos, right? So if you have Yom Tiv on Friday, Shabbos usually falls out on Shabbos. So can you go ahead and make an eruv tchumen and an eruv chatzeros on Friday? So the Gemara says, so Shmuel said the halacha follows Rebbe. Rebbe says you can make an eruv chatzeros, but you can't make an eruv tchumen. So says the Gemara, halacha karebi lekula o lechumra. When we say that the halacha follows Rebbe, does the halacha follow Rebbe lekula or lechumra? So pshita de lekula ka'amar. So the Gemara said pshita de lekula. It's obvious that it's clear. So Rebbe's position is a makil position, right? At the end of the day, Rebbe held that halacha lamais, you can make an eruv chatzeros, but you can't make an eruv tchumen. Remember again, what was Rebbe's logic? Rebbe said that since on Yom Tiv itself, there is no din of eruv chatzeros because you could carry. Therefore, that which is permitted, you're of course permitted to do. Tchumen does apply on Yom Tiv. And therefore, again, you can't make an eruv tchumen. Now, why is there a suffix? Mishum d'shalach Rabbi Lazar lagola, because Rabbi Lazar one time sent to Chutz Laaretz, lo kisha'atem shonim babel, Rabbi Matir v'chachamim osrim. You have the wrong attribution. It's not like you say in Babel that Rabbi is the one who is matir, making an eruv chatzeros on Yom Tiv, and the chachamim aser. Ella Rabbi oser v'chachamim matirim. Rather, again, it is Rabbi who says that it's aser, and the Chachamim say that it's mutter. So therefore, again, when we say the halacha is like Rebbe, which version of Rebbe are you referring to? So says the Gemara. Sorry. Jeremy, everything's frozen. I'm sorry. Okay, we're gonna go right there. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, maybe just shake it a little bit. Hit it. Okay. So it says the Gemara. So Tashma, Rav Tachlifa bar Avdimi avar uvda kavasi b'Shmuel. Rav Tachlifa bar Avdimi, he paskined in accordance with Shmuel. Shmuel, remember again, said that the halacha follows Rebbe. And ultimately, again, Rav said that the beginning of the psak halacha life of this particular Talmud Chacham is flawed. Now, I says he didn't like his psak. Good. All right. So ultimately, again, if halacha lemaisa, if you say that Rabbi was pasking lekula, then ultimately that's the kilkul that could come out of it. But if you hold that Rebbe is l'chumra, namely that halacha l'maisa, that Rebbe is l'chumra, namely that you can't go ahead and make an eruv chatzeros. So then halacha l'maisa, what kilkul could come out of that? Given the mekalkili barabim, hainu kilkul, the top of Yud Zayin. So Rashi, last Rashi, and that says sheshochin mutatim lo eruv. The kilkul that can come out of it is if you're machmir and you say that you can't make an Eruv Chatzeros on Yom Tov, then halacha l'maisa, people may come to go ahead and end up carrying. Therefore, again, the Gemara says, Amar Rava, Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Rav Huna, halacha karebi v'le'asar. That the halacha, in fact, follows Rebbe l'chumra, and we'll say this is how the Shulchan Aruch paskins as well. The Shulchan Aruch says that halacha l'maisa on Yom Tov, which goes into Shabbos, and let's say again, you forgot to make your Eruv Tchumin, you forgot to make your Eruv Chatzeros, halacha l'maisa, we don't do that on Yom Tov. So that's how you paskin, like Rebbe, but in accordance with the strict version of Rebbe. Beautiful. Tan Rabbanan. So we'll say we come now to a new sugya. Good. Okay. Take a new sugya. All right. Tan Rabbanan. Yom Tov shechalios b'Shabbos. So we'll say the Gemara says as follows. What happens when Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos? Beis Shammai Omrim. That was so we're transitioning a little bit over here to talk about tefillah. Beautiful, beautiful Gemara. So Yom Tov, which falls out on Shabbos. So how do you daven? Beis Shammai Omrim mispalel shmona v'omer shel Shabbos b'fnei atzma. So Beis Shammai says that when Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos, you daven an 8 bracha shmona esrei. Now, what does that mean? An 8 bracha shmona esrei? The first 3, the last 3, and in the middle there are 2 supplemental brachas. One for Shabbos and one for Yom Tov. V'omer shel Shabbos b'fnei atzma v'shel Yom Tov b'fnei atzma. Beis Hillel Omrim, Beis Hillel say mispalel sheva. Beis Hillel says no, you go ahead and you daven 7 brachas. What happens? And we'll say so. According to Beis Hillel, what happens? That middle bracha is a combination of Shabbos and Yom Tov. Thank you very much. Chevron on Zoom. I'm sorry. So we're going with this. Okay. Sorry, you're going to get my side profile. I should have trimmed my beard a little bit. I apologize. All right. And Jeremy, YouTube's working also? Good. Thank you. That really boosted my confidence significantly. All right. Okay. Okay, good. I'll leave it. Okay. Good. Beis Hillel Omrim, Mispalo Sheva. Beis Hillel says that halacha l'maisa, we go ahead and we only daven 7 brachas. Maschil b'shel Shabbos or Messiah b'shel Shabbos. Beis Hillel says that what we do is we go to daven 7 brachas. What does it mean 7 brachas? Meaning I both say that you daven the first 3, the last 3, and only 1 middle bracha. And inside of that middle bracha is both Shabbos and Yom Tov. However, Maschil b'shel Shabbos, the way the middle bracha starts, ultimately again is Shabbos, or Messiah b'shal Shabbos, and ultimately again it ends with Shabbos as well. Va'omer kiddushas hayom be'emsa. But there are Yom Tov insertions. Rabbi says, Av chosim ba mekadesh hashabos Yisrael v'hazmanim. And Rabbi says the way that you conclude that middle bracha is mekadesh hashabos Yisrael v'hazmanim. That order is going to be very important, as we'll see in just a moment. Tani Tana Kamei Ravina. There was a particular Tana who taught in front of Ravina, and he said the way to end the bracha is Mekadesh Yisrael v'hashabas v'hazmanim. The way to end it also is where you put the Yisrael. Is it Mekadesh Hashabas Yisrael v'hazmanim or Mekadesh Yisrael Hashabas v'hazmanim? Amar Leis, they said to him, that doesn't make sense. Atu Shabbos Yisrael Mekachile, but Shabbos Mekacha v'kaima. Ela Ema Mekadesh Hashabos Yisrael v'hazmanim. So says it's actually quite beautiful. So the Gemara says as follows. So the order over here is incredibly important because think about this for just a moment. When you have just a regular Yom Tov, how do we end off the bracha and Shmona Esrei? Mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim, or for that matter, Kiddush, right? Mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim. That order is very specific because we'll say who determines the timing of Yom Tov? Who determines it? Yisrael. We do, right? Because depending on when we declare the new month, ultimately again we'll determine when halacha l'maisa Yom Tov is. That's why the lashon of the bracha is Mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim. But if you're going to go ahead and say Mekadesh Yisrael v'hashabas v'hazmanim, that doesn't make sense. Why? Because Klal Yisrael, we don't determine the arrival of Shabbos. Right? At the end of the day, Shabbos is Kedushas Atzmo. Therefore, the way to formulate the bracha is Mekadesh HaShabbos. It's a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rebbe Shalom is one who sanctifies the Shabbos, v'Yisrael v'hazmanim. And then ultimately, again, Klal Yisrael goes ahead and takes care of sanctifying the Yom Tiv. So says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yosef, Halacha Karebi, Ugide Taritz Ravina. The halacha, in fact, follows Rebbe, that the way you'll end the bracha is Mekadesh HaShabbos v'Yisrael v'hazmanim, as Ravina explained. Beautiful. Bozilon, continuing on the tefillah theme. Tan Rabbanon, Shabbos shechalios b'Rosh Chodesh b'Chol HaShamoed. If Shabbos falls out on Rosh Chodesh or Chol HaMoed, the formulation here is interesting. Shabbos doesn't usually fall out on something. Something usually falls out on Shabbos. So it's an interesting formulation here. Shabbos shechalios b'Rosh Chodesh b'Chol HaShamoed. So what happens when Shabbos falls out on Rosh Chodesh or Chol HaMoed? I will say, now what I want to point out is as follows. What was happening beforehand was Yom Tiv and Shabbos coinciding. Now this is Rosh Chodesh or Chol HaMoed, which we'll call this kind of like a step below. So Rosh Chodesh Chol HaMoed falls out on Shabbos. What's the halacha? Arvis v'Shachris u'Mincha mispalel sheva. For Ma'ariv, for Shachris, and for Mincha, we daven 7 brachas. Va'omer me'in hama'ora ba'avoda. And what do? You insert Ya'alav Yavo. So we'll say, so when Rosh Chodesh or Chol HaMoed fall out on Shabbos, it's a regular Shabbos Shmona Esrei, ultimately with Ya'alav Yavo. That's Me'in HaMa'ora, means the tefillah which reflects the nature of the day. Rashi says over here, Rosh Chodesh o Moed, Ba'avoda, ultimately again in Ritzei. Ya'alav Yavo. V'im lo amar. What happens if you omitted Ya'alav Yavo on Rosh Chodesh or on Chol HaMoed? Machzir also, the halacha is you have to go back. Rabbi, they both say, now, interesting enough, one of the interesting distinctions between, let's say, Chol HaMoed and Rosh Chodesh is, if halacha l'maisa, you forgot Ya'alav Yavo at night of Rosh Chodesh, what's the halacha? You don't have to go back. And the logic behind that is the same way that Beitzah is not Mekadesh the Chodesh at Balayla at night. If you omitted Ya'alav Yavo, you don't have to go back. Interestingly enough, however, halacha l'maisa, if you go ahead and you forget Ya'alav Yavo on Yom Tiv, right, on Yom Tiv night, then you do have to go back. On Chol HaMoed night, then you would have to go back. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Ba'odah. Rabbi Eliezer says that halacha l'maisa, where should you insert the Ya'alav Yavo? In Modim. Now, why does he say in Modim? This is very interesting. Rashi says, Ba'odah, Kimo sha'amar al hanisim b'Chanukah uPurim. So this is very interesting. His logic is the same way that we insert Ya'alav Yavo, al hanisim for Chanukah and Purim in Modim. So too Rabbi Eliezer feels that Ya'alav Yavo should go in Modim as well. An interesting machlokus. We know we don't pass in that way. We put it in Ritzei, not after Modim. And in Musaf, we begin with Shabbos and end with Shabbos. In other words, we have Yom Tiv insertions, but Lamaisa, it's right. We have primarily Shabbos brachas. Va'omer kedushas hayom be'emtza. We recite Kiddushim in the middle of the bracha. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Rabbi Shmuel ben Osh, Rabbi Yochanan ben Baruch Omrim. Both of them say, Kol makom shehuskat l'sheva. Anytime you have a Shemona Esrei of 7 brachas, Maschil b'shal Shabbos or Misayim b'shal Shabbos. You begin ultimately again with Shabbos. You end with Shabbos. Va'omer Kiddushas hayom be'emtza. And you insert Kiddushas hayom, meaning Yom Tiv, in the middle. Amar Rav Huna. In halacha kol sazub, Rav Huna says the halacha does not follow this pair. Good, but say now we are back to Erev Tavshilin. So says the Gemara as follows. Before we get to Erev Tavshilin, other Eruvim. I'm Rabbi Chia bar Ashi Amrav. Maniach Adam Eruvei Tchumin Miyam Tov Lechavero Umasne. Now we'll say, so now we're talking about over here in a case of 2-day Yom Tiv Shein Shel Golios in Chutz La'aretz, where we operate halachically knowing that one of the days is Yom Tiv and one of the days is Chol. So what happens if a person forgot to make an Erev Tchumin before Yom Tiv? What happens? So says the Gemara, Maniach Adam Eruvei Tchumin Yom Tov Lechaveru Umasne. You make it tonight. What's the tonight? So on the first day of Yom Tiv, you say make an Erev Tchumin. If today is Yom Tiv, then my statement is meaningless. And if today is not Yom Tiv, then ultimately what? The Erev should be Chal, and you do the same exact thing on the second day. This way, again, It doesn't really work for the second day, but at least by the first, it doesn't work by the first day, but at least by the second day, you do have an intact Eruv Tchumen. Same idea, Rava says, you could make an Eruv Tavshilin on Yom Tov. If you forgot to make an Eruv Tavshilin before Yom Tov, Rava suggested halacha lamaisa, you can make an Eruv Tavshilin on Yom Tov itself with a Tanai. And what's the same idea? What's the Tanai? If today is Yom Tiv, then my statement is meaningless. But if tomorrow's Yom Tiv, right, on the second day, if tomorrow's right, but tomorrow's Yom Tiv, then ultimately again it should be chal for tomorrow. Second day, if they're the same make the same tonight both days, and by definition, by the second day of Yom Tiv, you have an intact Eruv Tavshilin. So the Gemara says, Man Amar Eruv Tchumen Kol Shekin Eruv Tavshilin. So says the Gemara. Most of all, if you take a quick look at Rashi, Rashi says, Yom Tov Lechavero, it's right across. In Niskar B'Yom Tov Rishon, V'chalu Shnei Yomim Tovim Chamishi Ve'erev Shabbos. So you forgot on Yom Tov, according to the first opinion that you didn't make an Erev Tchumen, according to the second opinion that you make an Erev Tavshilin. And what happened? Masne Im Hayom Chol Umachar Kodesh Eruv Eruv. If today is a weekday and tomorrow is Kodesh, then my Eruv should be an Eruv. V'im Chaluf. Any sarech la'arev l'tavshilin, right? La'arev l'tavshilin. Ubitchulin yomar im hayom kodesh ein b'divarai klom ulamachar yomar kain. So I will say. So again, Rashi is just pointing out the different tanaim because the verbiage of the different tanaim is a bit different by tchumen and by tavshilin. In any event, the mechanics are the same. So the Gemara says, man da'amar eruvei tchumen kol shkin eruvei tavshilin. The opinion who holds that you can make an Eruv Tchumen with a Tanai would certainly agree that what? You can make an Eruv Tavshilin with a Tanai as well. Uman Damar Eruv Tavshilin, but the opinion who holds that you can make an Eruv Tavshilin with a Tanai, Aval Eruv Tchumen lo. But he would hold that Allah Chalamais, you can't make an Eruv Tchumen with a Tanai. Why not? My taima, Dilamikne Shvisa Bishabsa lo. Because Rabbi said, remember again, Eruv Tchumen requires what? Acquiring a domicile. The act of acquiring a domicile is not something which should be done on Yom Tov. In other words, it looks too mechanistic. And therefore one should avoid it. And I will say that is indeed how we paskin. We'll discuss this, but technically speaking, there is a way to make an Eruv Tavshilin in Chutz La'aretz over the course of a 2-day Yom Tov. But as we saw before, we paskin that halacha l'maisa, we don't make an Eruv Tchumen or an Erev Chatzeros on Yom Tiv at all. Good. Tan Rabbanon, ain't ofen mi Yom Tov lechavero. You can't cook from one day Yom Tiv to the next, or actually bake from one day Yom Tiv to the next day. However, be'emes amru, memali isha kola kedera basar. Now, we'll say, now, remember, right now when the Gemara talks about baking, it's really just referring to cooking. So you're not allowed to prepare. We know this. Halacha might say you can't prepare from one day of Yom Tiv to the next. But interestingly enough, be'emes amru, however, Chazal said, memali isha kola kedera basar afa pi she'ena tzricha ela lechaticha achos. I will say this is very interesting, that when preparing for Yom Tiv, one need not be exact in their preparations. So in other words, we spoke about this before. If there are 5 people at my table, I don't have to make 5 pieces of chicken. In other words, I can go ahead and make many more pieces of chicken. And I will say now, why is that? Even though I know that I only need 5 pieces of chicken, or I know out of the 5 people at my house, only 3 people eat chicken, still you can make a lot more in the pot. Now, why is that permitted? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Isha, Debechad Tircha Sagi. I will say, because interestingly enough, in halacha, we look at the act of cooking, as one act. It's one act. So in other words, when you're putting chicken in the pot, so we don't view each individual piece of chicken as being its own tircha, but rather we look at the act of cooking as one comprehensive act. So once we look at it that way, then halacha l'maisa, there's no problem to add even more than what you need. Now I will say there's another piece to this. The Meiri has a whole discussion over here, and we'll get to this as well. There's a concept in halacha also called riboy bashiurim. That's what this is. That you don't have to cook exactly, you can add on. The assumption also is that when you cook in greater volume, that goes ahead and enhances the taste. Now, every yeshiva bacher would argue on that premise, right? But lamaisa, when you cook correctly, there's a greater flavor, right? There's a greater intensity. So even if I only need 3 pieces of chicken, the act of cooking 10 together enhances those 3 that I'm going to eat. That's the svara of ribui bashiurim. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So the Gemara says, Memali isha kola kedera basar. Same idea. Okay, here it's just illustrating with meat. Right? A woman could go ahead and fill up an entire pot with meat, even though she only needs 1 piece. Now, again, Rashi's logic is because it's chad tircha. It's all considered to be the same act of exertion. But lamaisa, there's also the concept that the more meat you have, the greater the flavor intensity, and therefore, again, the greater benefit I derive from it. Similarly, the baker could fill up a barrel of water, even though he only needs 1 jug. So both say, therefore, the Gemara says, avalefos. This is all true when it comes to cooking, because when it comes to cooking, the assumption is the greater the volume, the better the taste. Avalefos or chatircha. Avalefos, when it comes to baking, eina ofe ela mashet tzarechlo. Both say, but this is different than baking. When it comes to baking, halacha l'maisa, you could only bake that which you need on Yom Tiv. So in other words, the Gemara is suggesting over here is the concept of riboy bashiurim, right? The concept of going ahead and adding on, either because it's 1 tier. Well, the truth is, really what it is it's not 1 tircha. Because also think about this just for a moment. When you bake bread, right? It's not the pshat, oh, well, I'm baking 1 loaf, I'm baking 10 loaves, right? At the end of the day, each loaf is its own tircha. Right? Each loaf is its own expenditure of effort. And therefore, Allah you can only go ahead and bake what you need. So the Gemara says, so how, I'm sorry. Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer, Memali Isha Kala Taner Pas. It's not true. Rabbi Shimon Elazar says you can even bake a whole oven full of loaves of bread, even if you only need 1 loaf. Why? Bisman shat tanur male. Very interesting, because at the end of the day, 1 loaf bakes better when the entire oven is full. So Reb Shimon Elazar suggested halacha l'maisa, the same way that cooking a full pot of meat or a full pot of chicken has a positive qualitative effect on the meat and on the chicken, so too cooking a full oven with bread, right? The full oven of bread, even though you only need 1 loaf, has a qualitative positive impact on that 1 loaf you're going to use. Let's say beautiful Mr. Haskell as well. 1 loaf bakes fine. But when 1 loaf is in the oven with a whole bunch of other loaves, it's so much better. You could learn on your own, you could steig on your own, you could grow on your own, but at the end, and your loaf comes out just fine. But at the end of the day, when you come to the base medrash, at the end of the day, when you surround yourself with chaverim, at the end of the day, when you're part of a chabura, your loaf comes out so much better. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava, halacha Rabbi Shimon Elazar. Rava said, halacha Rabbi Shimon Elazar. Rava said, that indeed is the halacha. Interestingly enough, now again, it's only the halacha if it's true. See, b'pashtos, what kind of oven are they referring to over here? They're referring to not our kind of oven, right? Remember, how do they used to bake bread on both sides? How do they used to bake bread? You would slap the dough, again, it's not a technical term, but stick the dough against the side of the oven. That's how they're baking bread. So it sounds like what they're saying is like this: the less airspace there is in the oven, the more concentrated the heat is, the better the bread bakes. So therefore, both sides, while the halacha is true, I don't necessarily know that it would be true, for our own baking in our home, right? You could bake on Yom Tiv, but I don't know if you decide you want a fresh cake, a fresh challah on Yom Tiv. So I don't think one can make the argument that what does it matter if I bake 1 loaf or if I bake 10 loaves. L'maisa, again, I don't know that the qualitative impact of baking more together in an oven would apply to our particular type of setup. But again, halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says the svara does apply. Oh, Dilmahuna Asar Ve'en Kimchon Asar. Abu said, listen to this interesting shaila. So I didn't make an Erev Tavshilin. I didn't make an Erev Tavshilin. Okay, so obviously now I can't go ahead and cook, right? I can't cook. So now, what's the shaila? I can't cook. Is my, now the Gemara is asking about my flour, but it's not just flour, it's my ingredients in general. Are my ingredients usser or not? Right? Are my ingredients usher or not? So is the isser to prepare now for Yom Tiv just devolve upon me, or does it devolve upon me and my ingredients as well? So the Gemara says, "Oh, Dilma, who nesar ve'inkim chonesar?" Or no, maybe no, maybe I can't cook, but my ingredients are just fine. So lamai nafkamina. What exactly does this mean? What's the nafkamina over here? Says the Gemara, laknuye kimcho la'acherim. Can I go ahead, or do I have to go ahead and be makne my kemach to other people? Now, what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. Laknuye kimcho im tzarach laseis b'matanas kimcho shachirim mutarim la'afoso b'laseislo. So, listen to this. If let's say other people want to prepare for me, so do I have to be makne? Do I have to convey ownership of my kemach to them, my flour, my ingredients? Now, now, how do we decide that, Shaila? It depends. What does it depend on? If my kemach is not usher, if the isser is just on me, right, but not on my kemach, then what? Then what? Anyone could potentially prepare for me using my ingredients. But if my kemach is usher, then the only way someone could prepare for me with my ingredients is how? Is if I transfer ownership of my ingredients over to them. So that now it's no longer my ingredients. Therefore, there's no isser upon those ingredients, and someone else has the ability to prepare. Here we go. If you say that I am asur and my ingredients become asur as well, then I have to convey ownership of my kemach to other people. But if you say only I become asur, but my ingredients do not become asur, then then I don't have to be makne. And others, under certain circumstances, would be able to go ahead and prepare for me. So what's the halacha? Tashma. So listen to this. If you did not make an erev tavshilin, so then you can't bake, you can't cook, you can't insulate pots, right? Not for yourself and not for others. V'lo acherim ofen umevashlin lo. And other people can't cook or bake for me. So the Gemara says, Ketzadu osa. So what do I do? Okay, so I forgot an erev tavshilin, but I still need to eat. So what do I do? Ketzadu osa. Makne kimcho la'acherim. You should be makne your ingredients to someone else. In other words, convey ownership of your ingredients to someone else. Va'ofen lo umevashlin lo. And they will cook for me and bake for me. What do you see from here? Shmamina hu ne'asar b'kimcho ne'asar shmamina. What's amazing? What do you see from here? That when you fail to make an erev tavshilin, I become aser, right? I, the person who didn't make the erev, and my ingredients as well. To mean that what? That if someone else is going to prepare for me, I actually have to be makne my ingredients over to them. Now, this is interesting because normally we would try to avoid kinyanim on Shabbos as well, but Lamais in a situation like this, he would be able to be makne his ingredients over to someone else. We'll say, see an incredible lesson in this, which is what? When I make the bad decisions in life, my bad decisions, which again, Baruch Hashem, I just want to point out, isn't it incredible that now each of us, we can say, I have not yet made any bad decisions in life, right? Hopefully, right? Hopefully, right? A brand new slate, a brand new year. I can honestly make the statement, I haven't yet made any bad decisions. What a schus to be able to make that statement. Halabai should be able to make it for much longer. But I want to point out over here, what do you see from here? That when you make bad decisions, when a person makes bad decisions in life, those bad decisions don't just impact me. Those bad decisions have an impact on other things in life. It's so important because often we make siloed decisions, right? I make a decision and I figure the only person this decision impacts is me. And the only thing it impacts is this Metzias. And then we discover, unfortunately, that often our decisions have a ripple effect. So you see from here, the guy goes ahead and decides not to make an erev tavshilin. And what happens doesn't only impact you, it even impacts your ingredients. Every decision has a ripple effect. So the Gemara goes like, Avar va'afar mai. What's an interesting shaila? What happens if a person didn't make an Erev Tavshilin, but they still went ahead and cooked? They still went ahead and cooked. What is the status of the food? So Avar va'afar mai tashma mishalo iniach Erev Tavshilin keitzad hu oseh. If someone didn't make an Erev Tavshilin, so what should he do? Makne kimcho la'achirim, va'achirin ofen lo umevashlo. What we just said before. If you didn't make an Erev Tavshilin, what should you do? Be makne your ingredients to someone else, and they'll prepare for you. Amid days, v'i isa listening avar va'avar mutar. Now, if it's true that if you just cooked anyway, if you just cooked anyway, that halacha l'maisa it's mutar, they should have put that in there. In other words, they should have put another case. If a person didn't make an Erev, but cooked anyway, ultimately, again, his food is mutter. The fact that that's not there would seem to indicate that the food is aser. Tano, takanta de katani, takanta de isur lo katani. No, because we'll say the Tana is trying to find a mutter way to remedy your situation. If a person did not go ahead and make an Erev Tavshilin, so the Tana is trying to give you a permitted way to remedy that problem. The Tana is not going to advise you to cook anyway, because ex post facto, that which you prepared is going to be mutter. So the Gemara says, Tashma, let's analyze a bit more. If somebody made an Erev Tavshilin based on that, he can bake, he can cook, he can insulate. But if he wants to go ahead and eat his Erev, he's permitted to do so. So you could eat your Erev if you want to. However, achlo ad shelo achal, ad shelo hitmin. But if you ended up eating your Erev before you baked, or before you cooked, or before you did atmana, hare ze lo yofeh v'lo yivash v'lo yatmin lolo v'lo la'achirim. We'll say if you end up eating your Eruv before you could prepare anything, then you can't prepare. You can't prepare, not for yourself, not for others. And other people can't prepare for him as well. So we'll say it's actually interesting. What can you do if you go ahead and you forgot to make an Eruv? So the Gemara said, you could cook for Yom Tiv. Because remember, again, you only need an Eruv Tavshilin for what? For what? For Yom Tiv preparing it to Shabbos. You could still cook on Yom Tiv, v'im hosir l'Shabbos. But interestingly, so we'll say, so going back to our previous sugya, if you forgot an Erev Tavshilin, there is a potential saving grace, which is what? Ribui bashiurim. Cooking a lot for Yom Tiv. Because remember, again, as we pointed out, you could overcook for Yom Tiv, knowing that you're overcooking, with the premise that at the end of the day, there's a taste benefit, right, for increasing the volume. And that way you have left over for Shabbos. Ubilvad shelo yarim. Ultimately, again, as long as what? As long as you don't employ a subterfuge, right? So I'll say, now what does that mean? Look at Rashi. Shelo yarim, la'achar shabicha shel litzorech, lomar, o dani sarach lahazmin archim, v'yivashal tavshilan achirim v'yoserim l'shabbos. So we'll say, listen to this. According to Rashi, here's the Arama. Well, so imagine the following situation. You had lunch, right? You had lunch. And now you said, you know what? You realize, oh, I didn't make an Erev Tavshilin. So you say to yourself, we have unexpected company that stops by all the time. Let me just whip up 4 briskets, right? Then a couple of sides, just in case company stops by. So I will say, and I want to point out, there is a concept in halacha, we'll get to this, of preparing food for guests in the event that they come over. Right? There is a concept like that. It has to be reasonable, though. So that's when the Gemara says over here, if you realize, now again, as opposed to, I will say, if you're preparing your Yom Tov food, there's absolutely no problem with increasing the volume. If you're looking at Rashi, Rashi goes on, he says, Aval b'kedera achos im yarbe l'shabbos ha'omer da'afilu l'kol shar. You will say, so remember again, when you're actually preparing your Yom Tov Su'udah, ribui bashiurim, adding in extra food, that's fine. That's totally fine. That's not considered harama. That's not considered to be like a wink wink or a subterfuge. That's considered to be a normative act of food preparation for Yom Tiv. And Allah Lamais, again, the Svar, according to Rashi, Chad Tircha, it's all the same exertion. There's no exertion in putting in extra chicken into the pot, or according to the Meiri, ultimately, again, it enhances the taste value. Again, what they're talking about over here is after your Su'udah, preparing another Su'udah, because quote unquote, oh, maybe guests will come over, when you know full well that you're doing this for Shabbos. Bim Harim, and I will say, if you did this, Aser. Ultimately, again, the food is Aser. So I will say it's actually quite dramatic. If you did employ a subterfuge, and after your Su'udah on Yom Tiv, you, Mamish, prepared another Su'udah. You said that it's for Archim, but it's clear circumstantially that you're doing this for Shabbos. The food will be Aser. So we'll say, so remember again, I just want to point out, what are we trying to figure out over here? The Gemara is a simple question, which is, if a person went ahead and didn't make an Erev, but cooked anyway, is the food mutter or not? That's what the Gemara is trying to figure out over here. Now, interestingly enough, the Gemara says, you see from this case that what? That if you prepare food in a subterfuged fashion, right, right, using harama, that the food is going to be aser. So the Gemara wants to suggest, the Gemara's assumption, even though it doesn't state it explicitly, is the same way that employing food with harama is going to be aser. So too, if you didn't have an erev tafshilin and you cooked anyway, your food will be aser as well. I will say, to which the Gemara says something absolutely startling. Amr Rashi, harama ka'amrit, you're bringing up a case of harama, shiny harama, da'achmiru ba rabbanon tfei mimezid. I will say, listen to this. Harama is different, employing a subterfuge is different, because Chazal were more machmir with harama than they are with a mezid. I will say, this is incredible. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, shiny harama, the olam avar va'afar mutter. It could very well be that if you didn't have an erev tavshilin, but you cooked anyway, it'll be mutter. Even though you did something wrong, it'll be mutter. It'll be mutter. So the Gemara says, va'arama ein araya. You can't bring a raya from the arama case. Why not? Because the shiny ha'arama mimezid, the ika lamemar achmur barabanon ba'arama temi mezid, because the rabbanon were more machmir with harama than with mezid. The ilu mezid rashahu. Lavra divrei chachamim ve'ein achirim lemeitim hemenu v'atzmo masim alibo v'shav hilchach lo ma'akra toras erev. Rabbi say, listen to this. Says the Gemara, harama is worse than mezid. Why? Because Rabbi say there's a twofold concern over here. There's what the action means for me, and there's the potential maris ayin issue. What the maris ayin issue, Rabbi say, is if somebody engages in harama. Right? Remember, the whole chap with harama is, it looks mutter, right? It looks mutter, but it's really aser. So a person will see me preparing my 4 briskets and 3 sides after I finish lunch, because guests make, quote unquote, come over, and people will say, oh, that looks pretty mutter, right? So I'll do that also, right? As opposed to the case of mezid, people generally know when a mezid. They generally know a mezid, and no one comes to learn from a mezid. I will say, but there's another piece as well, which is the personalistic piece. See, I will say, when a person is amazed, they know that what? I know what I'm doing is wrong. When I know what I'm doing is wrong, there's a greater probability that I'll come to fix it. Harama means I'm employing a subterfuge. When people use harama, often what happens? They convince themselves that what they're doing is really okay. And when I convince myself that what I'm doing is okay, then what? It's almost virtually impossible to ever become a Baal Tshuva. We'll say, isn't this incredible? That on Matzah Yom Kippur and Isru Chag, right, we have a Gemara about Tshuva. Do you know why? Because when does Tshuva start? When does Tshuva really start? It already started in Ma'ariv. Why do we say in Ma'ariv last night? Slach lanu avinu ki chatanu, mechal lanu makinu ki fashanu. Tshuva always starts because it's great to be about Tshuva, and it's great to be a perpetual about Tshuva. I will say, but what an incredible yisod. The worst thing in life. See, we all commit averos. Halavai, not yet. Maybe we could hold out for another couple of hours, right? But it'll happen. We all commit averos. The most important thing in the world of sin is own it. Own it. Be amazing. Now, let me qualify that, right? Let me qualify that very carefully, right? I was saying, maybe it's hashkafa, YouTube isn't working this morning, right? Right? So be amazing. That what? If you do something, own it. Own it. Don't explain it away. Because if we see people say this is my simachol yom, people, it's becoming. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says, why did Klal Yisrael go ahead and build the golden calf? Why did they build the eagle? Because they wanted immorality, but they wanted a system that supported immorality. Nobody wants to be a sinner. So I'm not a sinner. I just subscribe to a different hashkafa, right? And my hashkafa allows this. My halacha allows this. My religion allows this. So we'll say, and that's dangerous because at the end of the day, when I justify my actions, it's so difficult to ever turn them around. But if I accept the premise that I sin and I acknowledge my sins, I know I'm not perfect. So of course I do many things wrong, but I acknowledge and I own the fact that it's wrong. If I'm amazed and I understand that what I'm doing is wrong, then there's a much better possibility and probability that I will come to fix it. But if I spend my life explaining away my averus or my erroneous lifestyles or the things that I just do wrong, then at the end of the day, unfortunately, harama has an incredible way of becoming heter. And once it becomes heter, it's so difficult, says Rashi, to become a Baal Tshuva. Incredible. Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Hamani Chananyahi. Who's the pain as this is Chananya? Valiba de Beishamai. Disanya, Chananya Omer, Beishamai Omrim, Ein Ofen Ela Imkain, Irev Bepas. Beishamai says, you can only bake on Yom Tiv if what? If you made an Erev with bread. Ve'in Mavashlan Ela Imkain, Erev Betavshil. And Beis Shammai says you can only cook if you made an Erev with a cooked food. Ve'in tomnin ela imkin hayu chamin tumunim erev yamtiv. And you could only insulate if you had pots insulated from erev yamtiv. Both say Beis Chananya or Beis Shammai according to Chananya has a fascinating shita. They said Erev tavshilin has to be comprised of a baked item, a cooked item, and if you want to insulate pots on yamtiv for Shabbos, an insulated item. In other words, that you need an Erev for every single type of thing you're going to do. Beisil says no. Now in yesterday's daf we saw that the Erev must be comprised of a cooked item. Bread by itself does not work. Bread by itself does not work. You have to have a cooked item. That's all you need. One cooked item, and that one cooked item is the entire Erev. So the Gemara says, Tanan. Hama asa perosa b'Shabbos. So again, we're still trying to figure out halacha l'maisa. If I violated and I cooked without an erev tavshilin, is the food mutter or not? So we're going to bring a couple of cases. Hama asa perosa b'Shabbos b'shogeg yochal v'mezel yochal. Let's say you tied your fruits on Shabbos. Not allowed to tie it on Shabbos, right? You took meiser on Shabbos. If you did it b'shogeg, you could eat your fruit. The mezid, you can't eat your fruit. So you see from here that if you commit an act of mazid, the food becomes aser. No, that case could be a case where I have other fruit. So because I have other fruit to eat, I can't eat the illegally tied fruit. Tashma, hamat bil kela b'Shabbos. If it was a utobi kelim on Shabbos, you take your kelim to the mikveh. Again, you're not supposed to do it tikkun mana, but if you did it, b'shogeg yishtamish fun. If you did it unintentionally, you can go ahead and use them. The mazid lo yishtamish b'hem. If you did it intentionally, you can't use them. So you see once again mazid as aser, which the Gemara says lo tzricha de islay mani achrini. It could be that a person has other utensils in this case. That's why you're not allowed to use it. Inami efshar b'sheila. The other possibility is you can always borrow utensils. Tashma hamavashel b'Shabbos. If a person goes in and cooks on Shabbos, b'shogeg yochal. If you cook b'shogeg, ultimately again it is permitted. The mazid lo yochal, but if you did it unintentionally, if you did it intentionally, you're not allowed to eat it. So you see from here what Rabbi say that mazid ultimately again is going to be aser. Rabbi say to which the Gemara says maybe Shabbos shiny Isura de Shabbos shiny. The Isser of Shabbos ultimately again will be different than any other Isser. We'll say halacha l'maisa. How do we paskin? If a person went ahead and cooked with it without an erev tavshilin, what is the halacha? So in Siman Taf Kuf Chav Zayin Sif Chav Gimel, the Shulchan Aruch paskins in upper b'mezid ubishal chama kederos shlo l'tzorech yantiv mutter la'achlon b'Shabbos or b'chol. Ultimately, again, the halacha is it's mutter. So as much, of course, as you're not supposed to do it, if you ended up cooking b'mezid without an erev tavshilin, the food is going to be mutter. But so let's go weiter a little bit. Says the Gemara. Who's Samya? Oh, I'm sorry, wrong down. Sorry. Says the Gemara. Beishamai omrim shnei tavshilin. Beis Shammai says you need 2 cooked dishes. 2 cooked dishes for Erev Tavshilin. Mas nisin Loki Haitana. Our Mishnah does not reflect the following Tana. Disanyo, Omri Rishim and Elazar, Modim Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, Ashnei Tavshilin Shetzarech. So listen to this. There's another Beitzah. In our Mishnah, there was machlokes about whether or not you need 1 tafshil or 2 tafshil. Beis Hillel says 1 tafshil, 1 cooked food. Beis Shammai says 2. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says over here, Shimon Elazar says there's another version of this. And in this other version, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both agree that what? You need shnei tafshilin. You need shnei tafshilin. What was their machlokes? Aman nechlaku al dag u Beitzah sha'alav. The machlokes, I will say, was what constitutes shnei tafshilin. What constitutes shnei tafshilin? Shevei Shammai om shnei tafshilin u Beis Hillel. So ultimately, for example, dag u Beitzah. Let's say you have a fish and you have an egg on top of the fish. Right? You put an egg on the fish. So what's the halacha? Shevei Shammai om shnei tafshilin. Beis Shammai says that counts as 2 food items. U Beis Hillel omrim tafshil echad. Beis Hillel says no, that's only 1 tafshil. B'shavim, but they both agree. Shem pir per Beitzah v'nosel sochadag, that if you mashed an egg and put that in the fish, Osha risek kaflutos, v'nosel sochadag, or you mashed leeks and you put that in the fish, shein shnei tafshilin. Ultimately, again, that there are 2 tafshilin. Amar Rava said, "Ha'ilchasa ketana didan b'alibud Beis Hillel." The halacha follows our Tana, like Beis Hillel, that you only need 1 tafshil for Erev tafshil. I both say it's just finished. The Mishnah says the Gemara, "Achlu osha abdu harizeh lo yivash alav." Remember again, if you lose your Erev or you eat your Erev before you have a chance to prepare, then halacha l'maaseh you can no longer utilize that Erev, which makes sense. It's no longer in existence. Amra Abayi Naktina, and we learned Hischel be'isasa v'ne'echal eruvo gomer. Both an interesting case. What happens if you began to bake your bread? And what happens in the course of baking, in the course of preparation, your Erev disappears, right? What's the halacha? Once you started, ultimately, again, you could finish. I will say, just allow me to close out the sugya with one important piece of halacha l'maisa. So I will say, so just so you know, so how do we make an Erev tafshilin? Just very quickly, there's so much more to the sugya of Erev tafshilin, but I just want to point out, I want to end off just with what should you be making the Erev tafshilin with? So the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Tav Kuf Chav Zayin Sif Beis says as follows: Erev zeh, when we make an Erev tafshilin, osin bepas v'tavshil. We make an Erev with bread and with a cooked food. Now the reason we do that is in deference to the opinion that we just saw before, namely that really Erev tafshilin should cover both bishul and afiyah independently. Right? We don't really do it for hatmana because we assume that hatmana is included, right? It's just like hadlaka statos, everything else is included. But we have 1 cooked item, 1 baked item. That's why people will often set aside a challah roll, a piece of matzah. Remember again, as we saw 2 days ago, halacha l'maisa, or yesterday, halacha l'maisa, the food doesn't have to be specifically prepared for Erev. So you could take a challah roll that you had already, or a piece of matzah that you had already, and 1 cooked food as well, a piece of fish, a piece of chicken, but that's how you do it. But the Shulchan Aruch says, "Ve'im lo asa elu mitavshil levad." What happens if you forgot the baked item and you only had the tafshil? What's the halacha? Mutter. Ultimately, it works. Why? Because me'ikra didn't we paskin like Beis Hillel. That really all you need is tafshil echad. But in order to satisfy all of the opinions, we have something that is afui, something that is mavushal, something that is baked, something that is cooked, covering Erev tafshil on all bases. We'll say shkoyach.